On October 12, 1972, a small chartered plane took off from Uruguay, heading to Santiago, Chile. It carried 45 passengers, including a rugby team, their families, and friends. They were excited for their short journey, which usually takes only 3 hours. However, they had to cross the towering Andes Mountains, the longest mountain range in the world. What should have been a routine flight turned into a nightmare. The plane crashed in the Andes, leaving the survivors stranded in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. How did they endure the freezing temperatures, lack of food, and isolation for 70 days? What unimaginable decisions did they make to stay alive? This is the harrowing tale of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a story of survival against all odds. What happened next is almost beyond belief, yet it became known as the miracle of the Andes. The small chartered plane carrying the Uruguayan rugby team, their families and friends took off with high spirits and excitement. The weather was clear, and the passengers looked forward to a short, 3-hour flight over the majestic Andes Mountains to Santiago, Chile. However, as they approached the mountain range, the weather took a turn for the worse. A severe storm raged in the mountains, forcing the pilots to make an unscheduled stop in Mendoza, Argentina for the night. They hoped to resume their journey once the weather cleared up. The next day, October 13, 1972, the plane took off again at 2:18 p.m., with the pilots confident that the worst was behind them. For the next hour, the flight was smooth. The passengers relaxed, chatting and enjoying the view of the towering Andes below. But at 3:21 p.m., as the plane began its descent towards Santiago, turbulence struck, and the aircraft shook violently. The plane entered thick clouds, obscuring visibility. Suddenly, alarms blared in the cockpit, and the pilots realized they were dangerously close to a mountain. Despite their frantic efforts to gain altitude, the rear of the plane struck the mountain, tearing off the tail section and sending several passengers flying out of the aircraft. The plane continued to ascend briefly before plummeting downwards. In a series of terrifying collisions, the left wing was sheared off, and more passengers were ejected from the fuselage. The remaining front section of the plane crashed onto a glacier, sliding down the icy slope at a horrifying speed before coming to a violent stop. Amid the wreckage, 33 of the 45 passengers miraculously survived the initial impact. But their ordeal had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath, the survivors were in shock, many of them severely injured. Among them were 2 medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, who quickly took charge of tending to the wounded. They discovered that one of their fellow passengers, Fernando Parado, had suffered a severe head injury and was in a coma. The survivors huddled together in the remnants of the fuselage, using the wreckage as makeshift shelter from the freezing temperatures that plummeted to -30°C at night. Unbeknownst to them, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service had been alerted to the plane's disappearance within an hour of the crash. 4 aircraft were dispatched to search for the wreckage, but the task was daunting. The plane was white, blending seamlessly with the snow-covered landscape, making it nearly invisible from the air. The rescue teams scoured the mountains without success, and as night fell, hopes of a quick rescue faded. That first night, 5 more passengers succumbed to their injuries or the cold, reducing the number of survivors to 28. The survivors used luggage, seat cushions, and snow to insulate the fuselage, creating a barrier against the biting wind. They rationed the scant food supplies they had, which included a few chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, and some small jars of jam. As the days passed, the realization set in that they were truly alone, with no immediate hope of rescue. Despite the harsh conditions, the survivors made use of whatever resources they could find. One passenger, Fido Strach, ingeniously used a metal sheet to melt snow for drinking water, collecting the droplets in empty wine bottles. They fashioned makeshift snowshoes from seat cushions and used the wool from the seat covers to keep warm. On the second day, they attempted to write "Seos" on the plane's roof with lipstick, but they quickly ran out of the substance and had to abandon the effort. They then used suitcases to create a large cross in the snow, hoping it would be visible to any passing aircraft. 8 days after the crash, Fernando Parado emerged from his coma, only to discover that his mother had died in the crash and his sister was critically injured. Despite his best efforts, his sister succumbed to her injuries shortly after he regained consciousness. The survivors were growing weaker by the day, and the harsh reality of their situation became clearer. They had no way of signaling their location, and their food supplies were almost exhausted. By the 11th day, desperation set in. With no other options left, the survivors made the agonizing decision to eat the bodies of their deceased friends and family members. This choice was not made lightly, but it was the only means of survival. Roberto Canessa was the first to take this step, and gradually the others followed. The grisly task was deeply traumatic, but it provided the sustenance they needed to stay alive. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the crash site, burying the fuselage under a thick layer of snow. 8 more survivors perished in the avalanche, leaving only 19. Trapped beneath the snow, Parado used a metal pole to create an air hole, allowing them to breathe. After 2 days of digging, they managed to tunnel out and reach the surface, only to find themselves facing another snowstorm. For the next 3 days, they remained huddled in their cramped snow cave, waiting for the weather to clear. When the storm finally passed, the survivors emerged and realized they needed to take action. They could no longer wait for rescue. They had to find help themselves. Canessa, Parado, and another survivor, Antonio Vizintin, decided to embark on a perilous journey westward, believing that Chile was only a few kilometers away. They spent several days resting and gathering their strength, fashioning a makeshift sleeping bag from various pieces of clothing stitched together by 18-year-old Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the 3 men set out on their desperate trek. They soon found the tail section of the plane, which contained suitcases, chocolates, and a 2-way radio. Although they were unable to make the radio work, they spent the night there before continuing their journey. The following day, they decided to return to the crash site to retrieve the aircraft's batteries, hoping to power the radio. However, their efforts were in vain, as the radio system was incompatible with the batteries. With no other choice, Parado and Canessa pressed on, while Vizintin returned to the crash site to conserve food. The climb was arduous and exhausting, with the men battling extreme cold, thin air, and lack of proper equipment. After 3 days, they reached the peak of a mountain, only to see endless snow-covered peaks stretching in every direction. Despite this disheartening sight, they continued their descent, finally reaching a valley with a river. On December 20th, 10 days into their trek, they spotted signs of human presence: cows grazing in the fields. Exhausted and unable to walk further, they saw 3 men on horseback across the river. Parado tried to shout, but the roaring river drowned out his voice. Fortunately, one of the men noticed them and shouted back, indicating he would return the next day. True to his word, the man, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, returned with paper and pencils, which he threw across the river attached to a stone. Parado wrote a desperate note, explaining their situation and pleading for help. Catalan and his friends, shocked to learn that there were survivors from a 2-month-old plane crash, immediately set off to alert the authorities. Catalan rode for 10 hours to the nearest town, where he informed the army. Meanwhile, Parado and Canessa were taken to Los Maitines, where they finally received food and rest. They had trekked 61 kilometers over 10 days, surviving on sheer willpower. On December 22nd, 1972, 70 days after the crash, 2 helicopters reached the crash site, guided by Parado. The remaining 16 survivors were rescued, ending their horrific ordeal. They were airlifted to safety, suffering from altitude sickness, dehydration, and malnutrition, but alive. Their story, known as the Miracle of the Andes, is a testament to human resilience, courage, and the will to survive. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit can endure and triumph.